You open your eyes to darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of your bedroom, but something deeper, colder. The air smells of wood smoke and something indefinable. Decay, perhaps, or simply the absence of everything clean you've ever known. Your hand reaches out instinctively, searching for your phone, your lamp, anything familiar. Instead, your fingers brush against rough-hewn wood and straw that prickles your skin. This is not your world anymore. This is the Middle Ages. For the next 1,000 years of human history, you will navigate 3 distinct epochs of medieval life, each more challenging than the last. You will witness the collapse of civilization itself, survive the brutality of endless religious wars, and face a plague that will kill half of everyone you know. There will be no hospitals to save you, no police to protect you, no grocery stores to feed you. Every moment will be a test of your ability to adapt, to endure, to simply stay alive in a world that has forgotten the meaning of mercy. The question is not whether you'll suffer. The question is whether you'll survive. Let's find out. Part 1. The Early Middle Ages, 500 to 1000 CE. Chapter 1. Awakening to Chaos. The year is 476 CE, though you won't know that for certain. Calendar systems are fragmenting along with everything else. You're somewhere in what was once the Western Roman Empire, perhaps Gaul, perhaps Italia, perhaps Hispania. The exact location matters less than the universal truth. The world's greatest civilization is dying, and you're watching it happen in real time. You stumble out of whatever shelter you've found. A partially collapsed Roman villa, perhaps, its once pristine mosaic floors now covered in dirt and debris. The morning sun reveals a landscape that would be unrecognizable to anyone from your time. In the distance, you can see the remains of a Roman aqueduct, its arches broken like the ribs of some massive stone beast. Smoke rises from multiple directions. Not the clean smoke of controlled fires, but the thick, black smoke of destruction. A sound makes you freeze. Voices, speaking in a language that's almost Latin, but not quite. Germanic words mixed with corrupted Romance language. You're hearing the linguistic chaos that will eventually birth French, Spanish, and Italian, but right now, it's simply confusion made audible. You press yourself against the crumbling wall of the villa. Through a gap in the stones, you watch as a group of warriors passes by. They're Visigoths, though you won't learn this term for some time. They wear a mixture of Roman military equipment and their own tribal gear, looted armor over leather tunics, Roman helmets decorated with horsehair plumes. Some carry spears, others swords that look like they were forged by someone who'd seen a Roman gladius once and tried to replicate it from memory. This is your first lesson in medieval survival. The old rules are gone, but the new rules haven't been written yet. You're living in the gap between civilizations, and that gap is filled with violence. Let's be clear about what you're facing. The Western Roman Empire, which has provided relative peace and prosperity for 500 years, has just officially ended. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, has been deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain. But the collapse didn't happen overnight. You're witnessing the culmination of decades of decline. The infrastructure you took for granted in the Roman era is crumbling. Those magnificent roads that once connected the entire Mediterranean world, they're falling apart, and no one has the organization or resources to maintain them. The aqueducts that brought fresh water to cities, breaking down block by block. The public baths, the forums, the amphitheaters, all slowly being stripped for building materials or simply abandoned. The economy has essentially reverted to barter. The Roman currency system, which allowed trade across thousands of miles, is collapsing. You'll need to relearn how to value things without money. A chicken might be worth a day's work. A horse might be worth a year's harvest. Your labor might be worth your life, if you can find someone willing to protect you in exchange for it. The population is crashing. Disease, famine, and warfare are cutting through communities like a scythe through wheat. Cities that once held hundreds of thousands now struggle to maintain tens of thousands. Rome itself, which had a population of over 1 million at its height, will shrink to perhaps 30,000 within a few generations. You need food, shelter, and protection. In that order. And you need them fast. Your stomach is already cramping with hunger. When did you last eat? You can't remember. You need to find food. But in the dying days of Rome, food is the ultimate currency, and people kill for it regularly. The villa's kitchen is your first stop. Roman villas were designed to be self-sufficient, with their own gardens, wells, and storage rooms. You pick your way through the debris, careful not to cut yourself on broken pottery or step on rusty nails. Infection is a death sentence in this era, and you need to remember that every injury, no matter how minor, could kill you. The storage room is partially collapsed, but you can squeeze through. Your eyes adjust to the dimness, and you see amphorae, the large clay vessels Romans used to store everything from wine to olive oil to grain. Most have been broken or emptied, but in the corner, covered by fallen ceiling tiles, you find one that's intact. You crack the seal. The smell hits you first, sour, fermented, but not rotten. It's garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything. To your modern palate, it's repulsive. Your stomach doesn't care. You dip your fingers in and bring them to your mouth. The salt makes your tongue burn, but it's protein, it's calories, and it's yours. Behind a collapsed wall, you discover something better, a cache of preserved food. The Romans were masters of food preservation by necessity. You find dried fish, hard as wood but edible if you soak it in water. You find dried beans, sealed in clay pots with wax. You find honey, which never spoils, golden and perfect in its jar. This is enough to keep you alive for perhaps 2 weeks if you ration carefully. But then what? You need a long-term food strategy. If you're going to survive more than a few weeks, you need to understand early medieval agriculture, and it's nothing like what you're used to. The sophisticated Roman farming techniques are being forgotten. The large estates that produced surplus grain for export are being broken up or simply abandoned. You need to find a community, as much as the thought might terrify you. Humans are social animals, and in this era, isolation is death. A single person can't farm enough land to feed themselves while also hunting, gathering, protecting their property, and doing the 1,000 other tasks necessary for survival. You start walking. The old Roman road is still usable, though weeds push through cracks in the paving stones. You pass abandoned farmhouses, their roofs collapsed, their fields returning to forest. You pass burned-out villages, the smoke still fresh. You pass a crucified body at a crossroads, a warning from someone to someone else, the specifics lost but the message clear: stay away. After 3 days of walking, eating sparingly from your discovered food cache, you see smoke rising in a controlled way, cooking fires, not destruction. A village. You approach cautiously. This could be your salvation or your death, and you won't know which until you commit. The village is small, perhaps 30 structures arranged haphazardly around a central area. There are no walls, which tells you that either they're too poor to build defenses or they're under someone's protection. The fields around the village are divided into long, narrow strips. This is different from Roman agriculture, which favored large, square fields worked by gangs of slaves. This is the beginning of the medieval strip farming system, where each family works several scattered plots to ensure that everyone gets some good land and some bad land. The crops are primarily wheat and barley, with some vegetables and gardens near the houses. You notice that about 1/3 of the fields are lying fallow, not being planted this year. This is the two-field system, where half the land rests each year to recover its fertility. The three-field system won't be invented for another few centuries, representing a major agricultural innovation that will help support a growing population. But right now, with half the land unplanted, there's barely enough food for the people already here. What makes you think they'll want to share with you? You're spotted before you can decide whether to approach openly or try to sneak closer. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, sees you from the field where he's been scaring birds away from the young grain. He shouts, and within moments, a dozen adults have gathered, all armed. The weapons are crude by Roman military standards, mostly farming tools that can double as weapons: scythes, axes, hammers, staffs. One man has what might be a genuine sword, though it's rusty and poorly maintained. They regard you with a mixture of fear and hostility that you're starting to recognize as the default expression of early medieval peasants. You need to make yourself useful immediately, or they'll drive you away. Or worse. You approach with your hands visible and empty, making yourself as non-threatening as possible. The language barrier is significant. They speak a dialect that's part Latin, part Germanic, part something else entirely. But some words are close enough to Latin that you can understand the gist. They want to know who you are, where you're from, and what you want. Your answer needs to be simple and convincing. You've prepared for this during your walk. You tell them you're a refugee from a destroyed village to the south. This is believable because destroyed villages are everywhere. You tell them you have skills, you can work, you can contribute. This is essential because useless people don't eat. The headman, you recognize him by the way the others defer to him, looks you over with a farmer's eye, assessing your value like he might assess a plow horse. You're not strong enough for heavy field work, he judges, but perhaps you can do other tasks. He makes you an offer. You can stay and work for your food. You'll sleep in the barn with the animals. You'll eat after everyone else eats, and only if there's food left over. If you cause any problems, they'll drive you out or kill you, whichever is more convenient. You accept. You have no choice. Your first day of work begins before dawn. Someone shakes you awake where you've been sleeping on moldy straw, next to a cow that's been coughing all night. Your body aches from the cold and the hard ground. Your stomach is a knot of hunger. Welcome to daily life in the early Middle Ages. The work is endless and backbreaking. You spend your days doing the tasks no one else wants, mucking out animal pens, carrying water from the stream, gathering firewood from the forest, repairing fences. Your hands, soft from your modern life, blister and bleed. Your back screams. Your legs shake with exhaustion. The diet is monotonous and barely adequate. Porridge made from barley or wheat, cooked into a thick gruel. Sometimes there's a piece of dark bread, hard and rough, nothing like the bread you're used to. Once a week, if you're lucky, there's a thin soup with vegetables and perhaps a scrap of meat, usually the parts of the animal no one else wants. You're constantly hungry. The caloric intake is far less than your body needs for the physical labor you're performing. You can feel yourself getting thinner, your muscles becoming stringy, your face gaunt. This is normal for early medieval peasants who live on the edge of starvation even in good years. The sanitation is medieval in the truest sense of the word. There's no running water, no sewage system, no concept of germs. People defecate in a communal pit at the edge of the village. They rarely bathe. Water is for drinking and cooking, not for washing. The smell is overwhelming at first. Then you stop noticing it because you smell the same way. Disease is constant. Everyone has parasites, intestinal worms, lice, fleas. Skin infections are common and mostly ignored unless they become serious. People have chronic coughs, runny sores, rotten teeth, mysterious fevers. The average life expectancy is perhaps 35 years, and that's if you survive childhood, which half of all children don't. You watch a child die during your first month in the village. She's perhaps 5 years old, and she develops a fever that won't break. Her mother tries everything she knows, herbal remedies passed down through generations, prayers to saints, binding charms. Nothing works. The child dies over the course of 3 days, her small body racked with convulsions, her parents helpless. They bury her in the small cemetery near the village church. The priest says words in Latin that no one really understands. Life continues. This is another lesson. Death is commonplace, grief is brief, and sentiment is a luxury no one can afford. As the weeks pass, you begin to understand the social structure of your new home. It's simpler than Roman society, but also more rigid in some ways. At the top is the Lord, though you haven't seen him yet. He lives in a fortified manor house about an hour's walk away. The Lord owns the land, all of it. The villagers are his tenants, bound to him by obligations that are part tradition, part contract, part simple force. Below the Lord is his representative in the village, the bailiff or reeve. This is the headman who first accepted you. His job is to manage the Lord's interests, collecting rents, organizing labor, settling disputes, and ensuring the Lord gets his share of everything the village produces. Then come the full villagers, the households that have rights to farm strips in the common fields. They're not slaves, but they're not free either. They're obligated to work the Lord's land several days each week, to pay him a portion of their harvest, to give him chickens and eggs, and anything else he demands. In return, he theoretically protects them, though you haven't seen much evidence of that protection. Below them are the landless laborers and servants, like you. You have no rights, no property, no security. You work for food and shelter, and you can be dismissed at any time. And at the very bottom, lower than you, are the actual slaves. Yes, slavery still exists in post-Roman Europe. These are people captured in raids or born to slave parents. They have no rights at all, not even the theoretical ones that bind the Lord and his tenants. You're determined not to stay at the bottom of this hierarchy forever. You need to make yourself indispensable. Your modern knowledge is mostly useless. You can't explain antibiotics or chemistry without sounding like you're speaking in tongues. But you have some advantages if you can apply them cleverly. You notice that the village has no smithy. When tools break, they stay broken until someone makes the long, dangerous journey to the nearest town where a blacksmith works. This is a critical vulnerability. You don't know how to forge metal, but you know something about basic repairs. You start experimenting with techniques for mending broken tools without reforging them, binding cracked handles with leather strips soaked in water that shrink tight as they dry, reshaping bent nails in the fire, improvising replacements for missing parts. Your first success is repairing a broken sickle for one of the farmers. The wooden handle has split, making the tool dangerous to use. You remove the blade, shape a new handle from green wood, and bind it more securely than the original. The farmer is impressed. Word spreads. Soon people are bringing you their broken tools. You can't fix everything, but you fix enough that your status begins to rise. You're no longer just another mouth to feed. You're becoming useful. You also apply basic logic to farming problems. You notice that the villagers plant crops the same way every year, regardless of whether it worked well the previous year. You suggest trying different techniques, planting certain crops in different locations, preparing the soil differently, timing the planting based on weather signs. Some of your suggestions fail. Some work. The ones that work earn you more respect. But your greatest asset turns out to be literacy. You can read and write, skills that virtually no one in the village possesses. Even the priest can barely stumble through the Latin of the Mass. When the bailiff needs to keep records of what each household owes the Lord, he has to rely on his memory, which causes disputes and confusion. You offer to help. You create a simple system for recording obligations using marks on wooden tally sticks, a technology the villagers already understand. But you add something new. You make the marks systematic, consistent, verifiable. It's not quite writing, but it's more reliable than pure memory. The bailiff is impressed enough to move you out of the barn. You're given a corner of a household's living space, sharing it with an extended family of 8 people and their chickens. It's crowded, it's noisy, and it smells terrible. It's a significant promotion. You're beginning to understand that life in the early Middle Ages is dictated entirely by the agricultural calendar. Everything else, warfare, religion, social events, is scheduled around the needs of farming. This makes sense when you realize that perhaps 90% of the population is directly engaged in agriculture, and everyone else depends on that 90% for their food. Spring is planting season. The entire village turns out to prepare the fields. The soil is turned using wooden plows pulled by oxen, the same technology that's been used for thousands of years. The plows don't turn the soil deeply, they just scratch the surface, which means the fields need to be plowed multiple times in different directions to break up the earth adequately. Seeds are sown by hand, scattered across the prepared earth. It's an inefficient process. Many seeds fall where they won't grow, eaten by birds or washed away by rain. But no one has invented a better system yet. That won't happen for centuries. Summer is growing season, which sounds like it should be easier, but actually isn't. The fields need constant attention. Birds need to be scared away from the young grain. Weeds need to be pulled, though not too aggressively, or you'll damage the crops. The precious oxen need to be watched and moved to fresh pasture. Fences need to be maintained to keep animals out of the fields. You're assigned to bird scaring duty with the children. You spend long hours in the hot sun, waving a stick with rags tied to it, shouting at crows and starlings. It's mind-numbingly boring, but you understand its importance. A flock of birds can destroy a significant portion of the harvest in a single day, and that harvest is the difference between life and death for the village. Autumn is harvest season, and it's the most critical time of the year. Every able-bodied person works from dawn to dusk, cutting the grain with sickles, binding it into sheaves, transporting it to the threshing floor. The work is exhausting and urgent. Rain can ruin grain that's been cut but not yet stored, so speed is essential. This is when you see the full weight of the Lord's power. He sends his men to take his portion of the harvest, not just a tithe, but nearly half of everything the village has produced. The villagers have no choice but to hand it over, watching with silent desperation as carts full of grain leave for the Lord's manor. After the Lord's share is taken, what remains must be divided among the villagers. Some must be saved for seed for next year's planting. Some must be set aside to pay the church's tithe. What's left is what the village will eat over the winter, and you can do the math even if they can't. It's not enough. Winter is survival season. The work of farming largely stops, replaced by the work of not freezing or starving. Families huddle together for warmth in their small houses. Food is rationed carefully. People sleep more, their bodies automatically trying to conserve energy. This is when people die. The old, the weak, the sick, they don't make it through winter. Every spring, the village is a little smaller, a little poorer, a little more desperate. But you've made it through your first year. You're thinner, harder, marked by scars and illness. You've seen people die. You've eaten things you never imagined eating. You've worked until your hands bled and your muscles screamed. You've survived. You're learning that the early Middle Ages is not just poor and dirty and hard, it's also extraordinarily violent in ways both casual and catastrophic. The casual violence is constant. Men settle disputes with their fists or with farm tools used as weapons. Women are struck by their husbands with a regularity that no one questions. Children are beaten for infractions both real and imagined. Animals are treated with a brutality that makes you sick until you become numb to it. But the catastrophic violence is worse because it comes without warning and leaves nothing but devastation in its wake. It happens on a morning that starts like any other. You're working in the fields when someone shouts and points. In the distance, riders are approaching. Not just a few, dozens of them, moving fast. The village erupts in panic. Raiders, it doesn't matter who they are, Goths, Franks, Burgundians, Saxons, independent war bands looking for plunder, the effect is the same. The bailiff shouts orders. Women and children run for the forest. Men grab whatever weapons they can find, knowing they're inadequate but having no other option. You run with everyone else, your heart hammering, your breath coming in gasps. You make it to the tree line and hide in the undergrowth with a handful of other villagers. From here, you watch what happens to your home. The raiders sweep through the village systematically. They're not interested in killing everyone. Dead peasants don't produce food. but they're not careful either. A man who tries to defend his home is cut down in his doorway. A woman who runs is caught and dragged behind a house. You hear her screaming, then silence. The raiders take everything portable: food stores, tools, animals, people. They set fire to several houses, not because they need to, but because they can. The smoke rises into the clear sky, visible for miles, a warning to other communities. This is what happens when you're weak. They're gone within an hour. The villagers emerge from hiding cautiously, like animals after a predator has passed. The damage is extensive, but not total. 4 people are dead. 3 more are missing, carried off to be sold as slaves. 2 houses are burned to the ground. Most of the food stores are gone. The survivors gather what remains and try to continue. There's no authority to appeal to, no justice to seek. The Lord, whose protection they're supposedly paying for, is nowhere to be seen. This is just reality in the early Middle Ages. Violence comes, destroys, and passes, and you rebuild if you can, and die if you can't. You help dig graves for the dead. You help salvage what can be saved from the burned houses. You help inventory what little food remains and calculate whether it's enough to get through to the next harvest. It's not, but you'll try anyway because the alternative is giving up, and humans rarely give up while they still have breath. In the chaos of the early Middle Ages, one institution remains relatively stable: the Church. It's the only organization that spans the fragmented landscape, the only common language in a world of competing dialects, the only source of anything resembling education or literacy. The village has a small church, barely more than a wooden hut with a cross on top. The priest is a peasant like everyone else, distinguished mainly by his tonsure, the shaved circle on top of his head, and his ability to mumble through the Latin prayers of the Mass. You attend services because everyone attends services. It's not optional. The church defines the rhythm of life as much as agriculture does. Sunday is a day of rest, not because anyone is concerned with worker welfare, but because it's God's day. Holy days, and there are many of them, mark the year as surely as planting and harvest. The Christianity practiced here is a strange hybrid of official doctrine and pre-Christian paganism. The priest preaches about saints and the Virgin Mary, but the villagers also leave offerings at old trees and springs, hedge their bets with charms against evil spirits, and believe in a whole cosmology of supernatural beings that the church officially denies. You learn to navigate both systems. You cross yourself when entering the church, but you also knock on wood to ward off bad luck. You pray to St. Christopher when traveling, but you also avoid certain forest paths where the old spirits are said to be strong. The church provides something else crucial: a sense of meaning in a world that otherwise seems arbitrary and cruel. When a child dies, the priest assures the parents that the child is in heaven. When crops fail, it's God's will, possibly punishment for sins, possibly a test of faith. When raiders come, it's either God's judgment or the work of the devil. But either way, it fits into a comprehensible framework. You find yourself adopting this mindset not because you necessarily believe it, but because the alternative, accepting that everything is random, that suffering has no meaning, that death comes without purpose, is too bleak to contemplate day after day. The church also offers the only education available. The priest teaches a few boys their letters, though teach is perhaps too strong a word. Mostly they memorize prayers in Latin they don't understand. But it's something, and you volunteer to help, sharing your literacy in exchange for a slight increase in status. Teaching gives you access to the church's library, which consists of perhaps a dozen books, all religious texts, all hand-copied, all in Latin. They're the most valuable objects in the village, worth more than houses or livestock. You read them hungrily, desperate for intellectual stimulation after months of mind-numbing physical labor. Through these texts, you begin to understand the theological world of the early Middle Ages. This is a Christianity that's obsessed with sin and salvation, with devils and angels, with the constant warfare between good and evil. It's a faith perfectly suited to a violent age, promising that suffering in this life will be rewarded in the next, that the wealthy and powerful who oppress the poor will face judgment, that justice exists even if it's not visible in the earthly realm. You're not sure if you believe any of it, but you understand why people need to believe it. As years pass, and you're realizing with a strange sense of displacement that you've now been in the early Middle Ages for 3 years, you begin to understand the political situation, or rather, the lack of one. The Roman Empire's collapse didn't create a new, stable system. Instead, it created dozens of competing kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy, each fighting with the others, each internally fractured into smaller units of power. The village where you live is theoretically part of the Frankish kingdom, though kingdom is too strong a word for what amounts to a loose confederation of warriors who've sworn personal loyalty to a king who has limited power to enforce his will. The real power lies with local strongmen, the lords who control land, and the warriors who defend it. Your own lord is one such strongman. You've seen him a few times now, when he rides through to collect rents or to muster men for some conflict you don't understand. He's younger than you expected, perhaps 30, scarred from battle, literate enough to read but not educated in any formal sense. He's not particularly cruel by the standards of his age, which is damning with faint praise. He takes what he's owed and a bit more, but he doesn't gratuitously abuse his power. He maintains rough order in his territory, settling disputes between villages, hanging thieves, and attempting to provide some protection from raiders, though, as you've learned, that protection is unreliable at best. But the Lord himself is bound by obligations upward. He owes military service to a more powerful Lord, who owes service to a more powerful Lord still, in a chain that theoretically leads to the king, but in practice is constantly being renegotiated through alliance, betrayal, warfare, and marriage. You watch this system operate from the bottom. When the Lord needs soldiers, he takes men from the village, your fellow peasants who've never trained for warfare, armed with improvised weapons, given a few days of rushed instruction, and sent off to fight in conflicts they don't understand for causes they don't care about. Some of them come back, some don't. Those who return are often injured in ways that make them unable to work, which means their families sink deeper into poverty, which means the village as a whole becomes poorer and more vulnerable. The feudal system is beginning to crystallize, though it won't be fully formed for several more centuries. The basic principle is simple: land for loyalty, protection for service. But the reality is infinitely more complex and more brutal than the theory suggests. You're living through the formation of a social structure that will define Europe for 1,000 years, and from your perspective at the bottom of it, it's not a particularly impressive or efficient system. But it's what's emerging from the chaos of Rome's collapse, and it's what you'll have to navigate if you want to continue surviving. The economy of the early Middle Ages is shockingly primitive compared to what Rome had achieved. The sophisticated monetary system, the long-distance trade networks, the specialization of labor, all of it has largely collapsed. Your village is almost entirely self-sufficient because it has to be. There are no markets where you can buy what you need. There are no shops, no merchants, no system of credit. The village produces almost everything it consumes: food, cloth, tools, building materials. This sounds romantic until you realize it means that everything is crude and in short supply. The bread is coarse. The cloth is rough. The tools are poorly made and constantly breaking. There's no variety, no luxury, no refinement. Trade exists, but it's sporadic and dangerous. A few times a year, traveling merchants appear, heavily armed groups of men with pack animals carrying goods from elsewhere. They bring salt, which is essential for preserving food, and which the village can't produce. They bring iron, which the local ore deposits can't provide in sufficient quantity. They bring occasional luxuries, spices, dyes, glass beads, but they charge exorbitant prices because the risks are enormous. Traveling merchants are prime targets for raiders, and they need to pay for protection, either hiring guards or paying tribute to local strongmen for safe passage. You see one of these merchant groups get hit during your 4th year in the village. You're working in the fields when you hear the sounds of fighting from the road. By the time you and others reach the scene, it's over. The merchants are dead or fled. Their goods are scattered across the road. Local people are already looting what they can before the Lord's men arrive to claim it all. This is what trade looks like in the early Middle Ages: brief, violent, unpredictable. The Lord occasionally organizes larger trading expeditions, sending carts full of grain or wool to distant towns, returning with goods the region can't produce. But these are major undertakings, requiring armed escorts, careful planning, and acceptance of significant risks. You volunteer to go on one of these expeditions, partly out of curiosity, partly hoping to expand your understanding of this medieval world. The journey takes 3 weeks each way, traveling perhaps 10 miles per day on roads that are barely passable. You see other villages, all similar to your own, small, poor, fearful. You see the remains of Roman towns, their populations reduced to fractions of what they once were, their buildings crumbling, their forums used as garbage dumps. You see the wild places between settlements growing larger as the human population shrinks and nature reclaims abandoned farmland. The town you finally reach is the largest settlement you've seen since arriving in the early Middle Ages. It has perhaps 2,000 inhabitants, making it a significant urban center by current standards. There are walls, rebuilt from the ruins of the Roman fortifications. There's a market, where goods from 100 miles around are traded. There's a bishop, residing in what was once the Roman administrative building. And there's poverty on a scale that makes your village look prosperous. Beggars line the streets. Orphans roam in packs, stealing what they can. The smell of human waste and decay is overwhelming even by medieval standards. You conduct your trade quickly, exchanging grain for iron tools, wool for salt, and leave, grateful to return to your village despite its hardships. At least there you know the dangers and have some social standing. In the town, you're anonymous and vulnerable, and the dangers are both more numerous and more varied. In your 5th year in the early Middle Ages, war comes to your region, not the casual raiding you've experienced before, but actual organized warfare between competing lords. The cause is complex, something about disputed territory, broken oaths, and an insult to someone's honor, but the effect is simple. Your lord and his men ride off to fight, and a few weeks later, an army appears in the area, living off the land, which is a polite way of saying they steal everything not nailed down. You get to see early medieval warfare up close, and it's nothing like the organized battles described in history books. It's mostly small groups of armored horsemen, the emerging class of knights, terrorizing the countryside, burning farms, driving off livestock, and occasionally fighting each other in brief, vicious skirmishes. The warriors are a class apart. They have horses, expensive animals that require constant care and feeding. They have armor, usually just leather reinforced with metal pieces, though a few wealthy warriors have chainmail. They have real weapons, swords forged by skilled smiths, spears, axes. But most importantly, they have time to train for war because they don't have to farm. They're supported by the labor of people like you, and in exchange, they're supposed to provide protection. In practice, they cause as much suffering as they prevent, but the system persists because physical force is the ultimate arbiter of all disputes in this era. Your village survives the passage of the army mainly by having nothing left worth stealing. The previous raid took most of your surplus. You're living on the edge of starvation already. The warriors look at the village, see there's nothing to take, and move on to richer targets. Your lord returns eventually, slightly wounded, having neither won nor lost his war. Things return to the previous status quo, except that several villagers are dead, killed during the army's passage, and the next harvest will be even smaller because the fields weren't properly tended while everyone was hiding or fleeing. This is the cycle of early medieval life. Brief periods of stability punctuated by violence and disruption, everyone trying to survive long enough for things to calm down, knowing that calm never lasts. As you approach the year 1000, though dating systems are confused and inconsistent, so different sources would place you anywhere from 997 to 1003, you notice a change in the atmosphere. People are talking more about the end times, about apocalyptic prophecies, about signs and wonders. The theology of the millennium varies depending on who you talk to. Some believe Christ will return exactly 1,000 years after his birth. Others think the world will end. Still others expect some kind of cosmic transformation, though they're vague on the details. The village priest gives sermons about repentance and preparation. People make pilgrimages to holy sites, seeking to cleanse their sins before the possible end. Disputes are settled, debts forgiven, enemies reconciled, at least temporarily. But the apocalypse doesn't come. The year 1000 passes, then 1001, then 1002. Life continues. The disappointment is palpable at first, but gradually people return to their normal concerns: planting, harvesting, surviving. You've been in the early Middle Ages for more than 20 years now. You've aged in ways that go beyond simple years. You're perhaps 40, but you look 60 by modern standards. Your hair is gray, your teeth are rotting, your body is a map of scars and old injuries that healed poorly. But you've also established yourself in the community. You're no longer the stranger who appeared out of nowhere. You're a full member of the village, with your own small plot of land, your own cottage, your own obligations and rights in the complex web of medieval social relations. You've married, a widow with children who needed someone to work her land and provide protection. It's a practical arrangement rather than romantic, but there's affection and partnership. You've raised her children as your own. One of them has recently gotten married himself, making you, improbably, a grandfather by medieval standards. You've survived the early Middle Ages, but the world is changing, and new challenges are emerging as Europe slowly begins to stabilize and organize itself into the feudal system that will define the next era. The High Middle Ages are approaching, and with them, new forms of violence, new social structures, and challenges you can't yet imagine. Part 2. The High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1250 CE. Chapter 2. The Age of Faith and Steel. The year is now approximately 1095, though you've long since stopped trying to track time precisely. You're an old man by medieval standards, perhaps 60, though you've lost exact count. Your body is failing in the slow, grinding way that bodies fail in an age without medicine. Your joints ache constantly. Your vision is clouding. Your hearing is diminished. But you're still alive, which is remarkable. You've outlived most of the people who were adults when you first arrived. You've become a village elder, someone people come to for advice and judgment. Your longevity itself is seen as a kind of wisdom, a sign that God favors you. The world has changed dramatically since you first opened your eyes in the dying days of Rome. The chaos of the early Middle Ages is slowly giving way to something more organized, more structured, more powerful in both its creativity and its capacity for destruction. The most obvious change is demographic. The population is growing for the first time in centuries. Your village, which had perhaps 30 households when you arrived, now has 60. New villages are being founded on land that was forest or swamp a generation ago. Fields are expanding. The forests are retreating before the axes of settlers. This growth is possible because of agricultural innovations. The heavy plow has arrived in your region, a technological marvel that can turn the thick clay soils of northern Europe far more effectively than the old Roman scratch plows. It requires a team of oxen to pull it, which means villagers must cooperate, pooling their animals, but the result is dramatically increased yields. The three-field system has replaced the old two-field rotation. Now only 1/3 of the land lies fallow each year instead of half, and crops are rotated in a way that maintains soil fertility better. Again, the yields increase. The watermill has been built on the stream that runs past the village. For centuries, grain was ground by hand, an exhausting and time-consuming task that fell primarily to women. Now the stream's power does the work, freeing up labor for other tasks. The Lord owns the mill and charges for its use, but even accounting for that cost, it's a dramatic improvement. All of these changes are small individually, but cumulatively they're creating something unprecedented: surplus. The village produces more food than it needs to survive. This surplus can support non-agricultural specialists, smiths, carpenters, weavers, and it can be taxed to support an increasingly elaborate political and religious structure. But with stability and surplus come new forms of conflict. The most significant of these is about to upend the world as you know it. The news arrives in the form of a wandering preacher, a gaunt man with wild eyes who speaks with the intensity of someone who's seen visions. He gathers the village around him and delivers his message. The Holy Land is in the hands of infidels. Jerusalem, where Christ walked and died and rose again, is controlled by Muslims who oppress Christian pilgrims and defile holy sites. The Pope himself, Urban II, has called for a crusade, a holy war to reclaim the sacred places. The preacher speaks of sin and redemption. Anyone who joins the crusade will receive a plenary indulgence, complete forgiveness of all sins. Warriors who die fighting will be assured of paradise. This is not just warfare. It's a pilgrimage, a spiritual journey undertaken with sword and spear. The village erupts in excitement and fervor. Young men see glory and adventure. The poor see an escape from crushing poverty. The sinful see a chance at redemption. Everyone sees something that their current life doesn't offer: meaning, purpose, change. Your grandson, the boy you helped raise, now a young man of perhaps 20, is among those who immediately declare their intention to take the cross. You try to talk him out of it. You know enough about medieval warfare to understand that the crusade will be a catastrophe for most of those who participate. But he won't listen. None of them will. The fever has taken hold. Over the next weeks, perhaps 40 men from your village and the surrounding area prepare to depart. They sew crosses onto their clothing. They make arrangements for their families. They train, insofar as peasants can train for warfare, learning to use spears and axes in formation. The Lord, a different man now, the grandson of the Lord you first knew, is also going, bringing his knights and as many equipped warriors as he can afford. He sees opportunity, land in the east, glory in battle, escape from the tedious work of managing a small feudal territory. You watch the preparations with a sense of foreboding. You've seen too much of medieval life to share their optimism. You know how rarely grand adventures end well for peasants. Your grandson and the others join what history will call the People's Crusade, though the people themselves don't know it by that name. They're part of a mass movement of thousands of common people, peasants, minor knights, clergy, and hangers-on of all sorts, moving east toward Jerusalem. You don't go with them. You're too old, and someone needs to stay and try to hold the village together in their absence. But you hear reports as messengers and survivors trickle back over the months that follow. The reality of the crusade is far from the glory that was promised. The People's Crusade, lacking real leadership or planning, devolves into a rabble. They pillage their way across Europe, attacking Jewish communities in the Rhineland, stealing from Christian peasants, leaving a trail of destruction. When they finally reach Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire's capital, they're bedraggled, starving, and disease-ridden. The Byzantine emperor, who had asked for military help from the West, is horrified by what's arrived. Not a disciplined army, but a mob. They're ferried across to Asia Minor and almost immediately annihilated by Turkish forces, who know the terrain and the tactics of warfare far better than these European peasants. Thousands die in a single battle. The survivors are sold into slavery or killed trying to escape. Your grandson is among the dead. The news reaches you 6 months after his departure. He died in a place whose name you can't pronounce, fighting people he knew nothing about, for a cause he barely understood, in a war that never should have involved him. You grieve in the medieval way, briefly, quietly, without the luxury of extended mourning. His widow and children move back into your household. You absorb them into your family because that's what survival requires. Life continues because it must. But the People's Crusade is just the chaotic prelude. The real crusade, the one historians will actually count, is being organized by powerful nobles with armies of professional warriors. Your lord returns briefly to muster more resources before departing again with this better organized force. He takes most of his knights and their equipment. He empties his treasury. He mortgages his lands to wealthy abbeys and bishops. He's betting everything on success in the Holy Land. This crusade is different. These men are trained warriors, they have proper equipment, and they're led by experienced commanders. They fight their way across Anatolia, capture Antioch after a brutal siege, and eventually reach Jerusalem itself. In July of 1099, they take the city. The reports that filter back to your village speak of a great victory, of holy sites reclaimed, of the crusaders wading through streets flowing with the blood of infidels. You're old enough now to understand that wading through streets of blood is not actually a cause for celebration, regardless of whose blood it is. But you keep this opinion to yourself. The village is celebrating because the crusade succeeded, because some of their men are coming home, because God has shown favor to the Christian cause. Your Lord returns eventually, 2 years after his departure. He's brought back relics, a splinter of wood claimed to be from the true cross, a piece of cloth that supposedly touched a saint's body. He's also brought back wealth, looted from the conquered territories. He uses this wealth to build a stone keep, replacing his old wooden manor house, and to endow a monastery. But he's also brought back fewer than half the men who left with him. The rest died of disease, battle, or simply disappeared in the vast distance between your village and Jerusalem. Every household in the village is missing someone. The grief is universal, even if the celebration is mandatory. The Crusades accelerate the development of the feudal system, solidifying it in ways that weren't clear before. The Lord who returns from crusade has seen how power is organized in other places, and he imports those ideas. He formalizes the obligations between himself and his vassals, the knights who hold land from him in exchange for military service. These obligations are written down, witnessed, and sworn before God. The knights owe him 40 days of military service per year. They must attend his court. They must provide advice when requested. They must pay various fees when daughters marry or sons inherit. In exchange, the Lord provides them with land, their fiefs, and protection. He settles their disputes. He represents them to higher authorities. He provides a structure within which they can live relatively secure lives, at least by medieval standards. You and the other peasants are bound by a different set of obligations. You're not technically slaves. You can't be bought and sold individually, but you're not free either. You're serfs, bound to the land and to the Lord who owns it. You owe the Lord labor, 3 days a week, working his fields instead of your own. You owe him a portion of your harvest, typically a third, but sometimes more. You owe him payments when your children marry or when you inherit land. You must use his mill to grind your grain and pay him for the privilege. You must use his oven to bake your bread and pay for that too. You cannot leave the manor without his permission. You cannot marry without his permission. Your children cannot leave to seek their fortunes elsewhere without his permission. Your permission is not your own. It belongs to the Lord as surely as the land does. In exchange, you receive protection, at least in theory. The Lord's knights are supposed to defend the village from raiders. The Lord's court is supposed to provide justice. The Lord's authority is supposed to maintain order. Sometimes these promises are kept, sometimes they're not. But the system is now so entrenched, so reinforced by law and custom and the authority of the church, that resistance is almost unthinkable. You're witnessing the full flowering of feudalism, the social structure that will define European life for centuries. From your perspective at the bottom of it, it's an improvement over the chaos of the early Middle Ages, but only just. You're slightly less likely to be murdered by raiders. You're slightly less likely to starve. But you're still poor, still powerless, still living under the absolute authority of men who consider you less than human. The church has changed as dramatically as secular society. When you first arrived in the Middle Ages, the church was barely organized, its clergy barely educated, its authority contested and limited. Now the church is becoming the most powerful institution in Europe. The Pope in Rome claims authority over all Christian souls, including kings and emperors. Bishops rule over territories like secular lords. Monasteries own vast estates and control enormous wealth. A new monastery has been established near your village, founded with some of the loot your lord brought back from crusade. It's a Cluniac house, following the reformed monastic rule that's spreading across Europe, emphasizing strict discipline, liturgical magnificence, and separation from the secular world. The monks are literate, educated men, the only educated class besides the clergy and a handful of nobles. They copy manuscripts, preserving ancient texts that would otherwise be lost. They sing the complex harmonies of Gregorian chant in their chapel, creating beauty that seems like a window into heaven in an otherwise brutal world. But they're also landlords, and often harsh ones. They own villages just as secular lords do, and their peasants are bound by the same obligations. They demand their rents and labor with the same insistence. They punish infractions with the same severity. The monastery brings benefits to the region, a small hospital for the sick, though the medicine practiced there is a mixture of herb lore and prayer that's only marginally effective. A scriptorium where books are copied, a school for boys who might enter the church. You're too old to benefit from these things directly, but you see the effects. The level of literacy is slowly rising. The quality of religious instruction is improving. The sense that the world is meaningful, that it's part of God's plan, is becoming more deeply embedded in the culture. The church also provides the primary social services of the age. It runs the hospitals, such as they are. It provides charity to the poor, though never enough. It offers sanctuary to criminals fleeing secular justice. It maintains the only functioning bureaucracy capable of keeping records and transmitting information across long distances. But it also exerts control over people's lives in ways that would be unthinkable in your original time. The church dictates when you can marry, whom you can marry, how you must conduct your sexual life. It enforces moral codes through the threat of excommunication and eternal damnation. It collects tithes, 10% of everything you produce, as rigorously as any secular lord collects rents. You navigate this religious landscape carefully. You attend Mass regularly. You confess your sins, though you're careful about what you actually confess. You contribute to the church's building projects and pay your tithes without obvious resentment. But in private, in the thoughts you don't share, you sometimes wonder if this elaborate religious structure is really about God, or if it's just another form of control, another way for those with power to extract labor and wealth from those without. One of the most dramatic changes of the High Middle Ages is the revival of urban life. The cities that shrank to villages during the early Middle Ages are growing again. New towns are being founded. Trade networks are extending across Europe and beyond. You visit the nearest city, the same one you visited decades ago during a trading expedition, and barely recognize it. The population has perhaps quintupled. New walls have been built to contain the growth. Stone buildings are replacing wooden ones. The market is held daily instead of weekly, and goods from places you've never heard of are being traded there. The city has guilds now, associations of craftsmen who control their trades with the jealousy of feudal lords guarding their territories. There's a weaver's guild, a smith's guild, a baker's guild. Each guild regulates who can practice the trade, sets prices, maintains quality standards, and provides support for members who fall on hard times. The guilds are creating a new social class, urban craftsmen and merchants who aren't nobles but also aren't peasants. They're accumulating wealth and demanding political power. Some cities are beginning to gain charters from kings or bishops, giving them the right to govern themselves within limits. This urban revival is possible because of the agricultural surplus. Enough food is being produced in the countryside to feed people who don't farm. This allows specialization and trade, which create wealth, which creates demand for more sophisticated goods, which creates more specialization in a virtuous cycle. But cities are also disease-ridden, dangerous, and morally suspect in the eyes of rural people. The population density creates perfect conditions for epidemics. Crime is common and organized. Gangs control neighborhoods, demanding protection money and enforcing their own rough justice. The church views cities as cesspits of sin, places where traditional moral authority breaks down. You're too old and too rooted in village life to move to a city, but you see the attraction. Cities offer opportunities that don't exist in rural areas, the chance to learn a trade, to accumulate wealth, to escape the rigid hierarchies of feudalism. Your great-grandchildren might make that move, though you won't live to see it. Warfare in the High Middle Ages is becoming more sophisticated and more devastating. The castle, in its fully developed form, is spreading across Europe. Your Lord's Stone Keep is just one example of a building boom in military architecture. Castles are force multipliers. A few dozen defenders in a well-built castle can hold off an army of hundreds or thousands. They project power across the surrounding territory, allowing the lord to control the countryside and collect taxes from a much larger area than would otherwise be possible. But they're also ruinously expensive to build and maintain. Your lord is constantly demanding more labor and more resources to upgrade his fortifications, add new towers, dig deeper ditches, build higher walls. The arms race extends to personal equipment. Knights now wear full chain mail, covering them from head to foot in thousands of interlocking rings. Their horses wear armor too. They carry longer lances, heavier swords, more protective shields. All of this equipment requires specialists to make and maintain: armorers, swordsmiths, horse trainers. It creates a military-industrial complex that consumes an enormous portion of society's resources. And it's frighteningly effective. You see a tournament near the city, a practice battle where knights fight each other for glory and prizes. Even though it's supposed to be non-lethal, men die. You watch mounted knights collide with an impact that sounds like thunder, lances splintering, horses screaming, men crushed under tons of metal and horseflesh. This is what warfare has become, a profession for specialized warriors so expensive to train and equip that only the wealthy can afford to participate. But when these warriors turn their attention to conquest or revenge, the devastation they cause is total. In 1147, the Pope calls for a second crusade. The Crusader states established after the First Crusade are under pressure from Muslim forces. The county of Edessa has fallen. Jerusalem itself is threatened. The response is immediate and massive. This time, it's not peasants and minor nobles, but kings who take the cross. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany both vow to lead armies east. Your region is required to contribute men and resources. The levies are heavy. The lords need money to equip their forces, and they extract it from their peasants. You're too old to go yourself, thank God, but you're expected to contribute through higher rents and special crusade taxes. The Second Crusade is a disaster. The armies are too large to supply effectively. They suffer from disease, starvation, and constant attacks by Turkish forces. The Crusaders achieve almost nothing militarily and eventually return home having accomplished nothing except enormous loss of life and treasure. But the crusading spirit continues. the Holy Land remains a magnetic pole in the European imagination, drawing warriors east in a conflict that will continue intermittently for another century and a half. You're old enough now to see the pattern. The Crusades are catastrophic for the common people who make up the majority of crusading armies. They're expensive for everyone who has to pay for them. They achieve almost nothing lasting, but they continue because they serve purposes beyond the stated religious goals. They provide opportunities for younger sons who won't inherit land. They offer adventure and purpose to a warrior class that might otherwise turn its violence inward against Christian neighbors. They channel religious fervor into external warfare rather than internal dissent. You understand this intellectually, but emotionally, you're simply tired of watching young men march off to die in distant lands for causes that never benefit the people doing the dying. Despite the warfare and the exploitation, life is actually improving in subtle ways during the High Middle Ages. The agricultural surplus means more food security. You rarely face the desperate near starvation of the early Middle Ages. Bad years still happen, but they're less catastrophic. The village has diversified economically. There's now a blacksmith who lives in the village itself rather than in the distant town. There's a carpenter, a wheelwright, a woman who's known for her skill with medicinal herbs. Your own cottage is more substantial than the hovel you first inhabited. It has a proper thatched roof that doesn't leak as badly as the old one. It has a stone hearth instead of just an open fire in the center of the room. It has a wooden floor in part of the structure instead of just packed earth. These are small improvements, but they matter. You're less cold in winter. Your food is less likely to be ruined by rain. Your living space is less likely to fill with smoke that makes everyone cough and wheeze. Clothing is better too. The village now has access to better quality wool and to dyes that were previously unavailable. Your clothes are still rough by modern standards, but they're warmer and last longer than the garments you wore in the early Middle Ages. The monastery has introduced new agricultural techniques, including the systematic breeding of better livestock. The sheep produce more wool. The cows produce more milk. The oxen are stronger and more reliable for plowing. All of these small improvements compound over decades. Life is still hard, still precarious, still limited in ways that would be unimaginable in your original time, but it's measurably better than it was when you arrived. A new monastic order arrives in your region. The Cistercians, followers of the Reformed rule developed at the monastery of Citeaux. They're even stricter than the Cluniacs, emphasizing manual labor, self-sufficiency, and withdrawal from secular concerns. The Cistercians found a monastery in the wilderness several miles from your village. They drain swamps, clear forests, and create from scratch a functioning agricultural estate. Within a few years, their lands are more productive than those of laypeople who've been farming the same ground for generations. They achieve this through systematic application of best practices, careful crop rotation, selective breeding of animals, investment in tools and infrastructure like mills and barns. They also have advantages that regular farmers don't. A literate administration that can keep detailed records, a long-term perspective unconstrained by the need for immediate returns and access to capital from wealthy donors. The Cistercian monastery becomes a model farm that gradually influences practices in the surrounding area. You see their techniques slowly adopted by your lord and then by individual farmers. The rate of innovation is slow by modern standards. Decades might pass before a new technique becomes widespread, but it's faster than during the early Middle Ages when innovation was almost non-existent. Perhaps the most significant change during your later years is the slow emergence of a real market economy. When you first arrived in the Middle Ages, almost all transactions were in kind: grain for labor, chickens for tools, service for protection. Money existed, but was rare and primarily used by the wealthy for large transactions. Now money is penetrating deeper into rural life. The Lord increasingly accepts cash rents instead of labor obligations. This is good for enterprising peasants who can produce surplus and sell it for cash, using the money to pay rent while keeping more of their own time. It's bad for peasants who can't produce surplus or who have no cash income. They're often worse off under the new system because cash is harder to come by than the grain or labor they previously owed. You're able to navigate the transition successfully. Your literacy gives you an advantage in keeping track of complex transactions. Your long experience helps you judge when to sell produce and when to hold it for better prices. You're never wealthy by medieval standards, but you achieve a modest prosperity that would have been impossible in the early Middle Ages. Markets are being held more regularly. The weekly market in the nearest town becomes a daily market. New market towns are being chartered, creating nodes in a network of trade that's slowly covering Europe. You can now buy things that previously didn't exist in your world. Better quality tools, more varieties of cloth, spices and medicines from distant lands. Books even, though they remain incredibly expensive. The emergence of a market economy is changing social relations in subtle ways. The bonds of reciprocal obligation that held medieval society together are being supplemented and sometimes replaced by cash transactions. This creates both opportunities and anxieties. Some of the young people you know are leaving the village to seek wage labor in towns, something that would have been almost unthinkable a generation ago. The lords try to prevent this movement, wanting to keep their laborers bound to the land, but they're only partially successful. You're witnessing the beginning of transformations that will eventually undermine the feudal system, though that's still centuries away. For now, the cash economy and feudal obligations coexist in an uneasy balance. The High Middle Ages is an era of intense religiosity, and that intensity expresses itself in both orthodox and heterodox forms. New religious movements are springing up everywhere. Some are approved by the church and channel enthusiasm into acceptable forms. Others are condemned as heresies and violently suppressed. A wandering preacher appears in your region, attracting crowds with his message of apostolic poverty and the corruption of the wealthy clergy. He argues that the church has strayed from Christ's teachings, that the monks and bishops live in luxury while professing to serve a God who praised the poor. His message resonates with peasants who've watched the church grow wealthy while they remain poor. Crowds gather to hear him speak. Some people begin to follow him, abandoning their homes and possessions to live as wandering preachers themselves. Then the bishop arrives with armed men. The preacher is arrested, tried for heresy, and burned. His followers are scattered. The brief excitement ends in ashes and terror. This pattern repeats across Europe. Movements that challenge the church's authority or its wealth are ruthlessly suppressed. The church cannot tolerate competition or criticism, especially when that criticism resonates with people's real experiences of exploitation. But the church also adapts. New orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans are approved, orders that emphasize poverty and preaching to the common people. These orders channel religious enthusiasm into forms that support rather than challenge ecclesiastical authority. You watch these movements with the cynicism of age. You've lived long enough to see that religious enthusiasm, whether orthodox or heretical, rarely benefits the common people in the long run. The structures of power and exploitation remain regardless of the theological debates happening above your head. You're approaching 80 now, an almost unimaginable age for a medieval peasant. Your survival is seen as miraculous, evidence of God's favor. People come to you for advice, for judgment, for stories of the old days. Your body is failing in ways that can't be ignored. You're nearly blind. You're almost deaf. Your joints are so damaged that walking is an ordeal. You spend most of your days sitting by the fire, wrapped in blankets, drifting in and out of sleep. But your mind remains relatively clear, and in those clear moments, you reflect on the life you've lived, the world you've inhabited for 8 decades. The High Middle Ages, for all their problems, represent an improvement over what came before. The population has grown, prosperity has increased, at least in relative terms. The social structures, while oppressive, provide more stability and predictability than the chaos of the early Middle Ages. But you also see storm clouds gathering. The population is pressing against the limits of what medieval agriculture can support. Every available acre is being farmed. The forests are being cleared to create new fields, but there's only so much land to clear. The cities are growing rapidly, which creates wealth, but also creates new problems: overcrowding, sanitation issues, new forms of crime and exploitation, and the potential for epidemic disease in densely packed populations. The crusading movement continues, but it's showing signs of exhaustion. The religious certainty that drove the First Crusade has been tempered by repeated failures. The costs are becoming harder to justify, and there's a restlessness in society, particularly among young people who've been taught that their station in life is fixed by divine will, but who can see evidence all around them that social mobility is possible, that the old rules are changing, that the future might be different from the past. You won't live to see how these tensions resolve. Your time is almost up. You die on a winter night, surrounded by your extended family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, several generations of people whose lives you've touched. The priest is there, administering last rites, offering the comforts of religion to a man who's never been entirely convinced by religious claims, but who appreciates the ritual and structure they provide. You're not afraid. Death is familiar in the Middle Ages. You've seen it so many times that it holds no mystery. You're curious, in a detached way, about what comes next, but you're not expecting much. Oblivion seems more likely than the elaborate cosmology of heaven and hell that the priest describes. Your last thoughts are of the life you've lived, the people you've known, the changes you've witnessed. You arrived in a collapsing world and lived to see a new world being built from its ruins. You've survived horrors that killed stronger people. You've found meaning and connection in unlikely places. Then the thoughts fade. The world fades. You're gone. They bury you in the village cemetery, next to people you've known for decades. The priest says the words. Your family mourns in the medieval fashion, intensely but briefly. Life continues because it must. But you've left something behind. Your descendants will carry fragments of your knowledge and your experience into future generations. The skills you developed, the adaptations you made, the strategies you employed to survive, these will be passed down and modified and passed down again. You've been a participant in history, not a maker of it, but a participant nonetheless. And in a strange way, you've influenced the course of events simply by surviving, by adapting, by doing what was necessary to persist in a world that seemed designed to kill you. The High Middle Ages will continue without you, building toward their own crisis that will make everything you've experienced seem mild by comparison. But that's a problem for those who come after. You've done your part. You've survived. And in the end, that's the only victory the Middle Ages really offers. Part 3. The Late Middle Ages, 1250 to 1500 CE. Chapter 3. The world turns dark. You open your eyes. Again. This shouldn't be possible. You died. You remember dying, the fading thoughts, the final breath, the darkness that followed. But somehow, impossibly, you're back. The year is approximately 1315, though you won't know this immediately. You're lying in a cottage that's more substantial than the ones you remember from earlier periods. The walls are partially stone, the roof is tiled rather than thatched. There's actual furniture, a bed frame, a table, stools, rather than just scattered straw and crude benches. But something is wrong. The air smells different, moldy, rotten, wrong. You sit up, and your body responds with an ease that shocks you. You're young again, perhaps 25, your muscles strong, your vision clear, your mind sharp. The questions swirl: how? Why? But they're luxuries you can't afford because you can hear shouting outside, and the shouts sound desperate. You stumble to the door and push it open. The scene that greets you stops your breath. It's raining, not the gentle spring rains that nourish crops, but a torrential downpour that's turning the world to mud. The fields are flooded, standing water covering what should be ripening grain. The stream that runs past the village has become a raging torrent, threatening to overflow its banks. And it won't stop. The rain just keeps falling. You've arrived at the beginning of what history will call the Great Famine, though the people living through it just call it the Hunger Years, or the Time of Death. The population of Europe has grown to the point where it's pressing against the absolute limits of medieval agriculture. Every available acre is being farmed. There's no buffer, no surplus, no margin for error. And then the weather fails. The spring of 1315 is abnormally wet. The summer is worse, cold and rainy when it should be warm and dry. The grain rots in the fields. The hay can't be dried. The livestock start dying from lack of fodder. The autumn harvest is catastrophic. In a normal year, a field might yield 8 bushels of grain for every bushel planted, a 7-to-1 return after replanting. This year, in the fields around your village, the return is perhaps 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. In some flooded fields, there's no harvest at all. The grain simply rotted where it stood. Winter comes, and there's not enough food. The carefully calculated balance of population and agricultural productivity has been shattered. The storehouse that should hold grain to last until spring is maybe 1/3 full. The livestock have been reduced by disease and slaughter. Animals were killed to feed people while they still had meat on their bones. Prices for what food exists skyrocket. A loaf of bread that cost a penny in 1314 costs 10 pennies in 1316, then 20. Then it's not available at any price because there's no bread to sell. People start starving. Not the gradual hunger that was background noise in earlier periods, but acute starvation that twists bodies and breaks minds. You see a woman eating grass, literally grazing like an animal because there's nothing else. You see children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs, too weak to cry. You see men who've given up, lying in their homes waiting for death because there's no point in struggling when there's nothing to struggle for. The social fabric begins to tear. People who've been neighbors for generations turn on each other. Food is stolen. Homes are broken into. There are whispered rumors, never confirmed but never quite dispelled, of cannibalism in the most desperate households. The Lord's granaries are raided by a mob. The Lord's men kill several rioters, but the rest get away with some grain. It doesn't matter. There's not enough food in the granaries to save everyone, even if it were distributed equally. By the spring of 1316, perhaps 1 in 10 people in your village is dead. The bodies are buried in mass graves because there's no energy for individual funerals. The priest says prayers over the pits, but his voice is weak from hunger, and the words sound hollow. The rain continues. The 1316 harvest is almost as bad as 1315. Now it's been 2 years of failed harvests, and the cumulative effect is catastrophic. The seed grain that should have been saved for planting was eaten in desperation. The breeding animals that should have been preserved were slaughtered. The system has consumed its own seed corn, literally and figuratively. You need to survive this, and your medieval knowledge gives you advantages that others lack. You understand the crisis in a way that people who've only known the prosperity of the High Middle Ages don't. First, you need calories from any source. The social prohibitions about what's acceptable to eat are luxuries that famine destroys. You eat things that would be disgusting in normal times. Tree bark stripped and boiled to extract any nutritional value. Acorns that are normally only fed to pigs. Grass seeds laboriously collected and ground. Roots dug from the forest. You trap birds and small animals with techniques you learned in the early Middle Ages. A sparrow is perhaps 20 calories of meat, barely worth the effort of catching and preparing. But in famine, every calorie counts. You set snares in the forest, checking them daily, eating whatever you catch immediately before anyone can steal it. You forage constantly. The forests and fields, even in this terrible weather, still contain edible plants if you know where to look. Nettles, though they sting, are edible when boiled. Wild mushrooms, if you can identify the safe species, provide nutrition. Certain roots, certain leaves, certain seeds. You become an expert in medieval survival foods. The knowledge saves your life and the lives of people you share it with. You organize groups to forage systematically, teaching them what you know. It's not enough to end the hunger, but it's enough to keep some people alive who would otherwise die. You also understand that protein is critical. The human body can survive for months on inadequate calories, but it fails much faster without protein. The livestock are mostly gone, but there are still rats, and rats are protein. You hunt them, trap them, eat them without hesitation or disgust. Others are horrified at first, but as hunger deepens, they follow your example. Rat hunting becomes organized. Children who still have energy are sent into barns and cellars to flush out rats for adults to kill. It's grim work, but it keeps people alive. The famine reveals the hollowness of the feudal social contract. The lords are supposed to protect and provide for their people. In exchange, the people owe labor and loyalty. But when the lord has no food to provide and demands labor from people who are starving, the arrangement loses all legitimacy. Your lord attempts to maintain his authority through force. He still demands rents. He still insists on labor obligations. He threatens punishment for anyone who fails to comply. But his authority is crumbling. What can he do to people who are already dying? Threats of punishment lose their power when death from starvation is the alternative. His own knights are hungry and angry, wondering why they should enforce obligations that the Lord himself isn't fulfilling. There's a confrontation in the spring of 1317. A group of villagers, driven past endurance, march to the Lord's manor and demand he open his remaining granaries and distribute the food. The Lord refuses. He needs that grain for seed, he says. If it's eaten now, there will be no harvest next year. He's technically correct, but the starving villagers don't care about next year. They care about today. The situation teeters on the edge of violence. The knights draw weapons. The peasants have crude tools, axes, hammers, scythes, but they outnumber the knights 10 to 1. You step into the middle of this confrontation, using your age and your reputation as a survivor to broker a compromise. The Lord will distribute some of the grain, enough to keep the most desperate alive, in exchange for a promise of labor when planting season comes. The seed grain will be preserved. Neither side is happy, but both sides back down. It's a temporary solution to an insoluble problem, but temporary solutions are all that's possible in famine. The summer of 1317 is finally, blessedly, normal, warm and dry enough for crops to grow properly. The harvest is still small because there was so little seed grain to plant, but it's a harvest, the first adequate one in 3 years. People eat the new grain immediately, barely waiting for it to be threshed and ground. The taste of fresh bread after 3 years of near starvation is almost overwhelming. You see people crying as they eat, not from sadness but from relief so intense it becomes emotional. The death toll is staggering. Your village has lost perhaps a third of its population. Some died of starvation. Others died of diseases that took hold in bodies weakened by hunger. Still others simply gave up, their will to live exhausted by years of suffering. The demographic impact extends beyond the deaths. Women who were malnourished during the famine bear children who are weak and sickly. The birth rate has plummeted because malnourished women don't conceive, and pregnant women who are starving often miscarry. The population recovery will take decades. But there's an unexpected consequence. With fewer people, there's more land per person. The survivors find themselves relatively better off than they were before the famine. There's land available for those who want to farm it. Wages for laborers increase because labor is scarcer. The balance of power between lords and peasants shifts slightly but measurably in favor of the peasants. This is cold comfort for the dead, but it matters for the survivors. You're living through a crisis that will reshape medieval society in ways that won't be fully clear for another generation. The decade after the famine is a period of slow recovery and gradual adaptation to new realities. The population is lower, The economy is contracted, but in some ways, life is actually improving for those who survived. You're able to acquire more land because there's no one to work it otherwise. The Lord is desperate to get his fields farmed, and he's willing to offer better terms to attract tenants. You negotiate a contract that reduces your labor obligations and your rents in exchange for farming land that's been abandoned. This kind of negotiation would have been unthinkable in the High Middle Ages, when population pressure meant lords could dictate terms. Now, the power dynamic has shifted. It's still not equal. The lord still has force on his side, but it's less lopsided than before. The village establishes a common granary, a shared resource where everyone contributes a portion of their harvest to be stored for emergencies. It's a practical response to the lesson of the famine. Individual households can't survive disasters, but communities with shared resources can. Agricultural techniques are also evolving. There's more emphasis on crops that are less vulnerable to weather: legumes, root vegetables, crops that can tolerate wet conditions. The monoculture of grain is being supplemented by diversity, which creates resilience. You see similar adaptations across society. The church, which lost credibility during the famine when its prayers demonstrably didn't work, is trying to rebuild its authority through increased charity and social services. Monasteries are establishing larger hospitals. Parish priests are organizing poor relief more systematically. The lords are also adapting. Those who were purely exploitative, taking everything and providing nothing, often lost their authority during the famine. Those who survived are learning to be slightly less extractive, providing real services in exchange for their rents, maintaining a functional social contract rather than a purely coercive relationship. It's still a profoundly unequal society. You're still at the bottom of a hierarchy that takes most of what you produce and gives back a fraction. But the famine has created some space for negotiation, some room for change that didn't exist before. The 1320s and 1330s are relatively stable years. The weather mostly cooperates. The harvests are adequate. The population begins to recover slowly. Trade expands as production increases. There's even some building of new structures, houses, barns, a new church to replace one that collapsed during the famine years. You marry during this period, to a widow with children, forming another of the practical partnerships that characterize medieval marriage. You farm your land. You fulfill your obligations to the Lord. You participate in village governance. You attend church. You live a life that would be recognizable to peasants across Europe. But there are signs, if you know where to look, that something worse is coming. Traders bring disturbing news from the east. There are reports of a terrible plague in China and Central Asia. Entire cities have been depopulated. The death toll is incomprehensible. Millions, perhaps tens of millions. The disease is said to kill in days, covering victims with black swellings, causing fever and delirium, spreading so fast that no one can outrun it. These reports seem distant, almost fantastical. China is impossibly far away. How could a disease there affect Europe? The prevailing medical theory is that disease is caused by bad air, by miasma rising from swamps and corpses. A disease in China can't produce bad air in Europe, but trade routes connect the world in ways that medieval people don't fully understand. Merchants travel the Silk Road. Ships sail the Mediterranean. Rats hide in grain shipments. Fleas ride on rats. And disease travels with all of them, invisible and inexorable. In 1347, ships arrive in Italian ports carrying merchants who are sick. Very sick. They have swellings in their groins and armpits, buboes they're called, giving the plague its name. They have fever. They're coughing blood. They're dying, and they're dying fast. The disease spreads from the ports, up the Italian peninsula, into France, across the Alps, following trade routes, traveling at the speed of medieval commerce, which is slow by modern standards, but terrifyingly fast when what's spreading is death. The Black Death has arrived in Europe. You hear about the plague for months before it reaches your region. Travelers bring reports of cities where half the population has died. of villages completely abandoned, of bodies piling up faster than they can be buried, of people going to bed healthy and dying before morning. The reports are so extreme that they're hard to believe. Surely they're exaggerated. Surely the disease can't be as deadly as claimed. Surely when it reaches your area, it won't be as bad. You know better. You lived through the famine. You know that reality can be worse than imagination. You begin preparing. You stockpile food. You repair your house to make it as secure as possible. You identify places in the forest where you could hide if the plague becomes overwhelming in the village. You tell your family what you're doing and why, though they think you're being overly cautious. Then, in the autumn of 1348, it arrives. A merchant who passed through the village becomes sick. Within 3 days, he's dead. Within a week, 5 more people are sick. Within 2 weeks, 20. The progression is exponential and horrifying. The symptoms are distinctive and terrible. Victims develop fever and chills. They become weak and disoriented. Black or purple swellings appear in their groins, armpits, or necks. The buboes that give the plague its name. The buboes grow to the size of eggs or apples, hard and painful. Some burst, oozing pus and blood. Victims cough blood. They develop black patches on their skin as blood vessels burst, the black in Black Death. They die in agony, often within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms. Some die faster, almost none recover. The disease is frighteningly contagious. People who care for the sick become sick themselves. Entire families are wiped out. The village priest, who bravely tends to the dying, succumbs within a week of the plague's arrival. You know that medieval medicine is helpless against this. The physicians, the few who exist and who haven't fled, try everything, bleeding patients to balance their humors, administering herbal remedies, burning aromatic woods to purify the air. Nothing works. The plague kills physicians as readily as anyone else. You make the hardest decision of your life. You take your immediate family and flee to the forest, away from the village and the plague. It goes against every instinct of community and mutual aid, but you understand something that medieval people don't. The plague spreads through contact. Distance is the only defense. You're not the only one with this idea. Others have fled too, setting up rough camps in the forest. But many of these refugees are already infected, carrying the plague with them. You avoid other people entirely, even other refugees. You set up camp in a remote location, near a stream but far from any paths. You hunt and forage. You don't light fires during the day because the smoke would reveal your location. You live like an animal, hiding from other humans who might be carrying death. Your family thinks you've gone mad. Why are you hiding in the forest when people in the village need help? Why are you avoiding other refugees who are suffering? Your explanation about disease spreading through contact makes no sense to them. Disease is caused by bad air and divine punishment. Everyone knows that. But you insist, and eventually they comply because you're the head of the household and because, on some level, your fear is contagious. You stay in the forest for 3 months. It's late autumn turning to winter, and the cold is brutal. You build a crude shelter from branches and leaves. You eat whatever you can find, which isn't much. You're cold, hungry, and miserable. But you're alive. In the winter of 1348 to 49, the plague finally abates in your region. The cold weather seems to slow its spread, though you don't understand why. In reality, the fleas that carry the plague are less active in cold weather, but this mechanism is completely unknown to medieval people. You cautiously return to the village. The scene that greets you is apocalyptic. More than half the village is dead. Houses stand empty, their doors open, corpses still lying inside because there was no one left to bury them. The fields are unplowed and unplanted. The animals, those that haven't died or been eaten by predators, wander freely, their pens broken or abandoned. The church is full of bodies. In the final days of the plague's rampage, people brought their dying relatives to the church, hoping for divine intervention. The intervention didn't come. The bodies are heaped inside, frozen by winter cold, preserved in grotesque tableaus of death. The survivors are traumatized beyond what you've seen even in the worst times before. They're not just grieving. Grief is common in the Middle Ages. They're broken. Their understanding of the world has been shattered. The plague killed randomly, the pious and the sinful, the young and the old, the rich and the poor. There was no pattern, no logic, no justice. Some survivors have turned to extreme religiosity, flagellating themselves in the belief that the plague was divine punishment for sin and that sufficient penance will prevent its return. Others have abandoned religion entirely, concluding that if God allows such suffering, he either doesn't exist or doesn't care. You begin the grim work of burial. The ground is frozen, making grave digging nearly impossible, but you do it anyway, because the bodies must be dealt with before they rot in the spring thaw. You dig mass graves, lay the bodies in them with as much dignity as you can manage, and cover them with earth and stones. The priest is dead, so you say the prayers yourself. You're not sure you believe them, but the survivors need ritual, need some sense that their dead are being honored rather than simply disposed of. The demographic impact of the Black Death is so extreme that it fundamentally restructures medieval society. In your village, more than half the population is dead. In some regions, the death toll is even higher, 2/3, 3/4. Europe has lost perhaps 1/3 of its total population, maybe more. With so few survivors, the balance of power between lords and peasants shifts dramatically. There's now an enormous amount of land and very few people to work it. Lords who once dictated terms are now desperate to find anyone willing to farm their fields. You're in a position to negotiate, and you negotiate hard. You take on more land, but only on terms that are extremely favorable: reduced rents, no labor obligations, a long-term lease that can't be arbitrarily revoked. The lord has no choice but to accept, because if you don't farm the land, no one will. This pattern repeats across Europe. The peasants who survived the plague find themselves with unprecedented bargaining power. Wages for laborers skyrocket, in some places doubling or tripling. Rents fall. Labor obligations are reduced or eliminated. The rigid feudal structure that had bound peasants to the land for centuries begins to crack. The lords naturally resist this transformation. They try to enforce the old obligations through law and force. In England, the Statute of Laborers attempts to cap wages at pre-plague levels. Similar laws are passed across Europe, but they're largely unenforceable because the economic reality, too much land, too few workers, overrides any legal restriction. Some lords turn to violence, attempting to force peasants back into the old relationships. This creates resentment and occasional rebellion. You see it in your own region. A group of peasants, pushed too far by a lord trying to reimpose feudal obligations, rise up and drive him out. The rebellion is eventually suppressed by a coalition of other lords, but not before demonstrating that the old order is no longer stable. The worst news is that the plague doesn't go away. It returns in waves: 1361, 1369, 1374, 1390. Each return kills fewer people than the initial outbreak, but each prevents the population from recovering. Every time it seems like society might stabilize, the plague returns and knocks everything askew again. You survive the second wave in 1361 by again fleeing to the forest. By now, you've learned the pattern. The plague arrives in summer or fall, spreads rapidly through dense populations, abates in winter. Distance and isolation are the only reliable protections. Others have learned too. The rich flee cities when plague threatens. Some nobles maintain multiple residences specifically so they can move from place to place ahead of outbreaks. The poor, who can't afford to flee, die in disproportionate numbers. The recurring plague creates a society that lives under the shadow of death. The medieval memento mori, remember you will die, becomes not just a religious sentiment, but a daily reality. Art becomes obsessed with death. Paintings of dancing skeletons, sculptures of rotting corpses, poems about the vanity of human ambition in the face of mortality. The phrase, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die," becomes a lived philosophy. Why save for the future when there might not be a future? Why defer gratification when death might come before you can enjoy your deferred rewards? The psychology of plague survivors is characterized by a strange mixture of fatalism and hedonism. The post-plague economy is radically different from what came before. With labor scarce and land abundant, the value of human work increases dramatically. This creates opportunities but also tensions. You become, by medieval standards, relatively prosperous. You farm a large amount of land, far more than you could have accessed before the plague. You produce surpluses that you sell in markets for cash. You use that cash to buy things that were previously out of reach: better tools, better clothing, better food. This upward mobility would have been nearly impossible before the plague. The rigid class structure of medieval society was designed to keep people in their assigned positions. But the plague has shattered that structure. Dead nobles leave inheritances that are contested. Dead lords leave lands that are taken over by whoever can hold them. Dead priests leave positions that are filled by less educated replacements. Social mobility in both directions becomes common. Some families rise from peasantry to minor gentry in a generation. Others fall from nobility to poverty because they lack the labor force to maintain their estates. The guild system in cities is also transforming. With fewer craftsmen, those who survive can charge higher prices for their work. Apprenticeships become more valuable. The quality of work sometimes suffers because there aren't enough skilled workers to maintain standards, but the survivors prosper. Trade expands despite the plague, or perhaps because of it. The survivors have more purchasing power per capita. Luxury goods that were once only for the wealthy become accessible to a broader population. The merchant class grows in wealth and power, challenging the traditional dominance of the landed nobility. As if the plague weren't enough, Europe is also tearing itself apart through warfare. The conflict between England and France that historians will call the 100 Years' War drags on, consuming resources and lives, creating additional instability on top of the plague's devastation. Your region is in France, and you see the effects of the war firsthand. English armies, or French armies fighting for rival claimants to the throne, or simply mercenary companies operating on their own account, periodically sweep through the countryside, taking what they want and destroying what they don't. The chevauchée, the deliberate strategy of devastating enemy territory, becomes common. Armies burn villages, slaughter livestock, destroy crops, all to deny resources to the enemy and to terrorize the population into submission. The theoretical distinction between combatants and non-combatants dissolves completely. You survive one of these raids by, again, fleeing to the forest. You watch from hiding as soldiers systematically loot your village, taking food, valuables, even the church's altar vessels. They set fire to several buildings before moving on. The damage isn't total. Some houses survive, some food remains hidden, but it sets back the community's recovery by years. The chronic warfare combines with the plague to create a world that feels like it's ending. Traditional authority has collapsed or proven itself incapable of maintaining order. The Church, which should provide spiritual comfort, is itself in crisis. The papacy is divided, rival popes excommunicate each other, corruption is rampant. The feudal system, which should provide stability and justice, is revealed as a protection racket where the strong exploit the weak. Into this vacuum step various alternatives: mystical religious movements, peasant communes, independent cities declaring their freedom from feudal lords, mercenary companies that function as de facto governments. It's a period of experimentation and chaos where the old rules no longer apply but new rules haven't been established. The plague has profound effects on religious belief and practice. The Church's credibility is damaged by its inability to prevent or cure the disease. Prayers didn't work. Saints didn't intervene. The plague killed clergy and lay people with equal enthusiasm. Some people respond with increased fervor, joining flagellant movements that process through towns whipping themselves, hoping to appease an angry god. Others turn to folk practices and superstitions, wearing charms, performing rituals, consulting wise women who claim to have protective magic. The clergy itself changes. So many priests died during the plague that replacements had to be found quickly, often without proper training. The quality of religious instruction declines. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, increases as sees and parishes need to be filled and those with money can purchase positions. But there's also genuine spiritual innovation. Mystical movements that emphasize direct personal experience of God, without need for clerical intermediation, gain followers. Texts advocating for translation of the Bible into vernacular languages circulate more widely. The seeds of what will eventually become the Protestant Reformation are being planted, though that transformation is still more than a century away. You find yourself with complicated feelings about religion. You attend church because it's socially necessary, because the community rituals provide structure and comfort, but you can't fully believe in a divine plan that includes the seemingly random horror of the plague. You go through the motions while harboring doubts that you carefully don't voice. The tensions created by the plague and the social changes it produces eventually explode into open revolt. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 is the most famous, but similar uprisings occur across Europe, including in your region of France. The revolts are driven by multiple factors: lords trying to reimpose feudal obligations that peasants thought were gone, new taxes to pay for the ongoing war, resentment of a nobility that's seen as parasitic and useless, and the sense among survivors that they deserve better than what they're getting. You're old by now, perhaps 70, but you participate in the planning of a local uprising. The immediate cause is a new tax demanded by the local noble to fund his contribution to the war effort. The peasants, who've been paying higher rents and dealing with periodic raids by soldiers, refuse to pay. The noble sends his men to collect the tax by force. The villagers resist. In the confrontation, one of the noble's men is killed. There's no going back from that. The villagers, knowing they'll be punished severely, decide to go all in. They march on the noble's manor. The revolt succeeds initially. The manor is taken. The noble flees. His treasury is distributed among the rebels. His records of debts and obligations are burned, a symbolic destruction of the old order. But the success is short-lived. A coalition of nobles assembles a military force. They retake the manor, capture the ringleaders, and execute them publicly as a warning to others. The revolt is crushed. You survive because you're old and you're clever. You were involved in the planning, but you made sure there's no evidence of your participation. When the nobles come asking questions, you play the role of a confused old man who was swept up in events he didn't understand. They believe you, or at least they can't prove otherwise, and you're spared. The revolt fails, but it matters. The nobles are shaken. They realize that the old order can't be maintained through force alone. Some accommodation must be made. The post-revolt settlement includes modest reforms, slightly lower taxes, slightly better terms for tenants, at least until memories fade and the balance of power shifts again. The later 14th and 15th centuries see remarkable technological and cultural developments, driven partly by the social changes the plague created. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg around 1450, begins to spread. You're too old and too rural to see one directly, but you hear reports of books that are produced by machine rather than copied by hand. The implications are staggering. Information can be reproduced and distributed on a scale previously unimaginable. Gunpowder weapons are developing. Early cannons appear on battlefields, though they're as dangerous to their operators as to the enemy. But the technology is improving. and it's clear that gunpowder will eventually make castle walls obsolete and transform warfare entirely. Artistic and intellectual culture is flourishing, especially in Italian cities. The Renaissance is beginning, though from your rural perspective, it's distant and abstract. But some of its effects reach even you. Better quality goods available in markets, new architectural styles, a general sense that the world is opening up and changing. The voyages of exploration begin. Portuguese sailors are pushing down the coast of Africa. There are rumors of attempts to find sea routes to Asia, to bypass the Muslim-controlled land routes. The world is being revealed as larger and more diverse than medieval Europeans imagined. You won't live to see most of these changes fully develop, but you can sense that something fundamental is shifting. The medieval world, the world of stable hierarchies, limited horizons, and unchanging traditions, is giving way to something new. What that something will be isn't yet clear, but it will be different. You die, finally, in the late 1400s. You've survived the famine, multiple waves of plague, warfare, social upheaval, and the general brutality of late medieval life. You've outlived almost everyone you've known. You've seen the world transform multiple times. Your death is quiet, in your sleep, in your own bed, surrounded by descendants who've benefited from the prosperity you managed to achieve. By medieval standards, it's a good death. You're old. You've made your peace with God, or at least gone through the motions, and you're leaving behind people who will continue after you. But what's more significant is what you've witnessed, the transformation of an entire civilization. You arrived in the chaos of Rome's collapse and survived through the long, slow reconstruction of society. You saw the feudal system rise, flourish, and begin to crack. You saw the church reach the height of its power and then face challenges to its authority. You witnessed demographic catastrophe on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. And through it all, you survived. Not through heroism or exceptional ability, but through adaptability, through willingness to do what was necessary, through understanding that survival in the Middle Ages requires constant attention to practical realities rather than abstract ideals. The Middle Ages are ending as you die. The modern world, with its nation-states, its capitalism, its scientific revolution, its global exploration, is beginning to emerge. You won't see it, but the changes you've witnessed are laying the groundwork for transformations even more dramatic than what you've experienced. Your life has been a thread in the tapestry of history. Not a golden thread, not one that stands out, but a thread nonetheless. You've been one of millions of ordinary people whose collective experiences, sufferings, and adaptations created the world that came after. And in the end, that's what the Middle Ages were. Not the romantic world of knights and castles that later generations would imagine, but 1,000 years of ordinary people trying to survive in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. You were one of them. You did survive. And that's enough. You've just survived 1,000 years of human history. 1,000 years of hunger, disease, violence, and unrelenting hardship. 1,000 years of adapting to circumstances that were designed to kill you. Of finding ways to persist when persistence seemed impossible. Let's recap what survival in the Middle Ages actually required. Agricultural knowledge. Everything revolves around food. Understanding crop rotation, recognizing edible plants, knowing when to plant and harvest. These aren't abstract skills. They're the difference between eating and starving. Social navigation. The hierarchies of medieval society are oppressive, but they're also the structure within which you must operate. Knowing when to submit, when to negotiate, when to resist, all crucial. Physical endurance. The sheer physical labor of medieval life is beyond what most modern people can imagine. Your body must become a tool, hardened through constant use, resistant to pain and exhaustion. Medical knowledge. Actual medieval medicine is worse than useless, But basic hygiene, understanding of infection, knowing which injuries require immediate attention, these save lives. Psychological resilience. Death is everywhere. Suffering is constant. Hope is often irrational. You must develop the ability to continue despite this, to find meaning in small things, to maintain human connections even when connection means sharing in others' suffering. Adaptability. The conditions change constantly. Invasions, plagues, famines, social upheavals. You must adapt to new realities quickly or die. The strategies that worked yesterday may be fatal tomorrow. Community integration. You cannot survive alone. Despite the competition for resources, despite the violence and betrayal, you must find ways to work with others because isolated individuals don't last long in the Middle Ages. But here's what's harder to say but needs to be said. Most people didn't survive. For every person who made it through all three periods of the Middle Ages, hundreds died along the way. Children died at astounding rates. Women died in childbirth. Men died in wars they didn't start fighting for causes they didn't understand. Everyone died of diseases that would be trivial to treat in the modern world. The Middle Ages weren't a romantic adventure. They were a grinding, brutal experience where human life was cheap and suffering was the norm. The castles we admire were built by forced labor. The cathedrals we marvel at were funded by taxing people who could barely afford to eat. The knights we romanticize were often little better than thugs with expensive equipment. You survived in this scenario by making choices that would be morally questionable in the modern world. Hoarding food while others starved, fleeing plague-stricken villages while leaving sick people behind, accommodating yourself to unjust systems because resistance was suicide. This is the reality of survival in desperate times. It's not heroic, it's not noble, it's simply the calculus of staying alive when every day is a struggle and when the systems around you are designed to exploit rather than support you. But there's also this. The Middle Ages, for all their horrors, were when much of modern European culture was forged. The languages, the legal systems, the agricultural techniques, the architectural styles, the philosophical and theological frameworks, all developed during this period. The universities were founded in the Middle Ages. The great cathedrals were built. The literature that still resonates, Dante, Chaucer, the Arthurian legends, was written. The technologies that would enable the modern world, watermills, windmills, the heavy plow, mechanical clocks, were invented or refined. This happened despite the violence and oppression, or perhaps in some complicated way because of it. The need to survive produced innovation. The concentration of power produced institutions that outlasted their creators. The suffering produced art and literature that grappled with fundamental human questions about meaning and purpose. You were part of that, not the part that gets remembered. You weren't a king or a bishop or an artist, but you were part of the vast foundation of ordinary human experience on which everything else was built. Your labor fed the monks who copied manuscripts. Your taxes funded the cathedrals. Your survival and adaptation helped create the genetic and cultural legacy that led to the world that came after. The honest answer is probably not. The gap between modern life and medieval life is so vast that most people transported back would die quickly. You lack the physical hardiness, the disease resistance, the practical skills, the psychological preparation. Even with all the knowledge this script has given you, and it's been designed to give you the maximum possible chance of survival, your odds would be poor. The first serious illness would probably kill you. The first winter without adequate food and shelter would probably kill you. The first encounter with violence would probably kill you. But let's say, hypothetically, that you had everything you needed: perfect health at the moment of transport, comprehensive knowledge of medieval life, the psychological resilience to endure unimaginable hardship, and a fair amount of luck. Even then, survival would require you to become someone different. The person who survives the Middle Ages is not the person who entered them. You would be hardened by suffering, coarsened by violence, numb to death and loss in ways that would make you almost unrecognizable to your former self. You would carry trauma, that you could never fully process or heal from because the concept of psychological trauma doesn't exist in the Middle Ages. You would have compromised your values repeatedly to survive. You would have done things you thought you could never do, seen things you thought you could never see, become things you thought you could never become. And at the end of it all, after surviving 1,000 years of medieval life, would you even be yourself anymore? Or would you be someone else entirely, shaped by the Middle Ages into a form that could persist in that world, but would be alien to the one you left? The most important lesson from this journey through the Middle Ages is not about the past, it's about the present. We live in a world of abundance that would be incomprehensible to medieval people. Food is readily available. Water is clean and plentiful. Diseases that killed millions are preventable or curable. Violence, while still present, is vastly reduced from medieval levels. The rule of law, imperfect as it is, provides protections that medieval peasants could only dream of. We take all of this for granted. We complain about inconveniences that would have seemed like miracles to someone living in the Middle Ages. We worry about problems that are real, but are problems of prosperity rather than problems of survival. This isn't to say that modern problems aren't real or that we should simply be grateful for what we have, but perspective matters. Understanding how brutal life has been for most of human history helps us appreciate how remarkable our current situation is and how fragile it might be. The systems that support modern life, agriculture, infrastructure, medicine, law enforcement, education, are not natural or inevitable. They're the product of centuries of development, built on the suffering and labor of countless generations who came before us. They can break down. They have broken down, repeatedly throughout history. The Middle Ages are what happens when complex systems collapse and take centuries to rebuild. The famine is what happens when climate and agriculture fail simultaneously. The plague is what happens when disease meets population density without medical intervention. The warfare is what happens when authority fragments and violence becomes the arbiter of disputes. These aren't ancient history. They're possibilities that remain latent in the human condition, kept at bay by systems that require constant maintenance and vigilance. But there's another lesson too, and it's more hopeful. Humans are astonishingly resilient. We can endure conditions that seem unendurable. We can adapt to circumstances that seem impossible. We can find meaning and connection and even moments of joy in the midst of overwhelming suffering. The people of the Middle Ages were not fundamentally different from us. They had the same range of emotions, the same capacity for love and hate, the same desire for security and meaning. They laughed, they cried, they hoped, they feared, they formed relationships, raised children, told stories, created beauty where they could. They did all of this while living in conditions that would destroy most of us within weeks. They persisted through horrors that we can barely imagine, and they did it not because they were heroes or saints, but because they were humans, and humans persist. This capacity for endurance is both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it suggests that we can survive almost anything if we must. Terrifying because it suggests that we can become habituated to almost anything, can normalize conditions that should never be normal, can accept suffering that should never be accepted. The Middle Ages persisted for 1,000 years, not because people fought against the system every day, but because most people, most of the time, simply accommodated themselves to it. They accepted their station, fulfilled their obligations, lived within the constraints they were given. The system perpetuated itself through this accommodation far more than through active coercion. This is worth remembering when we look at injustices in our own time. The question is not just, how did people tolerate this? But what are we tolerating that future generations will look back on with horror? What systems of oppression or exploitation are we accommodating ourselves to because they seem inevitable or because resistance seems futile? The Middle Ages had no sense of progress. People didn't believe that tomorrow would be better than today, or that their children's lives would be better than their own. If anything, they looked backward to a golden age, Rome, or the Garden of Eden, and saw history as a story of decline. But from our perspective, we can see progress. Slow, uneven, often invisible to those living through it, but real nonetheless. Agricultural productivity increased. Technology developed. Legal systems became more sophisticated. Literacy spread. The population recovered from catastrophes. Knowledge accumulated. This progress wasn't inevitable. It required the labor of millions of people, most of whose names are lost to history. It required innovations that were resisted and fought against before being accepted. It required the breakdown of old systems that couldn't adapt and the emergence of new systems that could. And it's continuing. The world is still changing, still developing, still presenting new challenges that require adaptation. The specific conditions of the Middle Ages won't return. We're not going to see feudalism or crusades or the Black Death in their original forms. But the fundamental challenges of human existence, how to organize society, how to distribute resources, how to manage violence, how to find meaning in suffering, how to balance individual freedom with collective needs, these remain. We're still working on the same problems that medieval people worked on, just with different tools and different constraints. So here you are, at the end of this thought experiment, having survived 3 distinct periods of medieval history. You've lived through the chaos of Rome's collapse, the rigid hierarchies of feudalism's height, and the demographic catastrophe of the late Middle Ages. You've learned skills you never wanted to learn. You've made moral compromises you never wanted to make. You've witnessed horrors you never wanted to see. You've become someone you never wanted to become, but you've survived, against odds that were stacked impossibly against you, through circumstances that killed millions of others. You've persisted. You've adapted when adaptation seemed impossible. You've endured when endurance seemed beyond human capability. You've found ways to continue when every rational calculation said that continuation was pointless. This is the ultimate lesson of the Middle Ages. Survival is possible, but it costs everything. It costs your innocence, your assumptions about how the world works, your belief in justice or fairness or meaning. It costs the person you were and replaces them with the person you had to become. And yet, people did it. For 1,000 years, across an entire continent, ordinary humans lived through these conditions and somehow created the foundation for everything that came after. They're your ancestors, literally or culturally, and their capacity for endurance is your inheritance. You carry their DNA, shaped by 1,000 years of survival under brutal conditions. You carry their culture, modified and developed but rooted in medieval foundations. You carry their legacy, the accumulated knowledge and institutions and technologies that they created or preserved. When you face challenges in your own life, and you will, because being human means facing challenges, you're drawing on resources that were forged in the crucible of the Middle Ages. The resilience, the adaptability, the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would be rational. These are gifts from people who had no choice but to develop them or die. So let me ask you one final question. Now that you've survived the Middle Ages, now that you've seen what humans are capable of enduring, now that you understand the gap between your comfortable modern existence and the brutal reality of most of human history, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you take your modern comforts more seriously, recognizing them as achievements rather than entitlements? Will you look at your own society's problems with more perspective, understanding that bad as they might be, they're nothing compared to what came before? Will you work to preserve and improve the systems that keep medieval conditions at bay? Or will you be radicalized by the recognition that the systems we have now are not natural or inevitable, but are human constructs that can be changed? Will you be inspired by the fact that even in the darkest periods of history, humans found ways to resist, to innovate, to imagine better alternatives? Will you refuse to accommodate yourself to injustices simply because they're less severe than medieval injustices? There's no single right answer. The Middle Ages teach different lessons to different people, but the experience of surviving them, even imaginatively, even through the safety of a narrative, should change you. It should give you perspective on your own life, on your own time, on your own challenges, because the truth is, we're all surviving something. Maybe not the Middle Ages, maybe not conditions of equivalent brutality, but challenges nonetheless. And the strategies that kept people alive through 1,000 years of medieval hardship, adaptability, community, resilience, the refusal to give up, these remain relevant. The Middle Ages are over. They ended centuries ago, swept away by changes that would have been unimaginable to the people living through them. But the human capacity for endurance that the Middle Ages both required and created, that remains. You have that capacity. You've always had it. But now, having survived the Middle Ages, you know it. You've tested it against the worst conditions in human history and found that survival is possible, even when it seems impossible. Carry that knowledge forward. Use it when you face your own challenges. Remember that humans have survived worse and continued. Remember that the systems that seem eternal and unchangeable are actually fragile and temporary. Remember that ordinary people, through their accumulated choices and adaptations, create history. You've survived the Middle Ages. Now survive your own time, with all its different but no less real challenges. And in surviving, help create the foundation for whatever comes next, just as medieval people created the foundation for the world you inherited. The journey is over. The knowledge is yours. What you do with it, that's up to you. If you've made it this far, if you've truly engaged with this journey through the Middle Ages, then you've done something remarkable. You've spent time imagining a world so different from your own that it's almost alien, a world where your survival would be improbable at best. The Middle Ages lasted 1,000 years. This script has covered perhaps 0.0001% of the experiences that occurred during that time. Every village, every household, every individual had their own story of survival or failure. Most of these stories are lost forever, unrecorded and unremembered. But the fact that you're here, reading or hearing this, means that someone in your ancestral line survived all of it. Someone made it through the famines, the plagues, the wars, the endless grinding poverty and violence. They survived long enough to have children who survived long enough to have children who eventually led to you. You exist because of a chain of survival stretching back through the Middle Ages and beyond. Every link in that chain represents someone who faced conditions you can barely imagine and somehow persisted. That's your inheritance. That's your legacy. That's the foundation on which your existence is built. Honor it by living well. Honor it by working to ensure that the hard-won progress of centuries continues. Honor it by refusing to take for granted the miraculous, by medieval standards, world you inhabit. The Middle Ages are over, but their lessons remain. Survival is possible. Adaptation is necessary. Endurance is the human condition. And despite everything, despite all the horror and suffering and injustice, life continues. Humans persist, and tomorrow comes. Thank you for surviving the Middle Ages with me. May you never have to do it for real.